My name is Kalen Drovarn. 3 years ago, I married the woman I thought was my soulmate. Last December, her family banned me from their Christmas celebration in Ashmont Valley, calling me, quote, worthless deadweight, who would never amount to anything meaningful in their successful daughter's life. What they didn't know? While they were dismissing me as a failed inventor tinkering in my garage, I was quietly developing a revolutionary water purification technology that would change everything. The patent I'd been perfecting for 6 years wasn't just some hobby project. It was about to become the largest environmental tech acquisition in industry history. But here's what they forgot. You can't humiliate someone who spent years preparing for exactly this moment. What happened next wasn't revenge. It was a $156 million headline that made their worthless son-in-law the most talked-about name in Vesira's family. Stick around. You'll want to see how quickly arrogance turns to desperation when legacy comes with a price tag. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut through Thornwick Heights like a blade, but it wasn't the cold that made my hands shake as I stood outside the imposing glass doors of Halcourt Manor. Through the frosted windows, I could see the warm amber glow of the Christmas gathering inside. Laughter echoing through grand hallways, the clinking of expensive champagne glasses, and the soft jazz music that Vesira's family always played during their holiday celebrations. I wasn't inside. I wasn't welcome inside. And for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I understood exactly what my place was in the Halcourt family hierarchy. The text message from my wife still burned in my phone. Dad says it's better if you don't come this year. Family only. We'll talk when I get home tomorrow. Family only. As if 3 years of marriage, 3 Christmases of awkward small talk and forced smiles, 3 years of trying to prove myself worthy of their daughter, meant nothing when push came to shove. But let me back up to how this moment came to exist, because the story of how Kalen Drovarn became persona non grata at Christmas dinner started months before, in the most unlikely place imaginable. 6 months earlier, I'd been sitting in my converted garage workshop in the industrial district of Thornwick Heights, surrounded by water filtration prototypes that most people would have called junk. Beakers, copper tubing, pressure gauges, and notebooks filled with calculations that made sense only to me. The space smelled of metal shavings and the faint chemical tang of the various compounds I'd been testing. My phone had buzzed with a call from Vesira. "Honey, Dad wants to know when you're planning to get a real job." That phrase had become a regular part of our conversations. Real job. As if 6 years of developing breakthrough water purification technology was somehow less real than Kalen Drovarn's commercial real estate empire, or Kalen Drovarn's hedge fund portfolio. "Tell him I'm still working on something important," I'd replied, not looking up from the filtration membrane I was examining under a microscope. "Kalen, he's offering you a position at Drovarn Properties, entry-level but at steady income, benefits, a career path." I'd set down the microscope and looked around my workshop. Months of 18-hour days had led to a breakthrough that could revolutionize how water treatment plants operated. The membrane technology I'd developed could process contaminated water at a fraction of the cost and energy consumption of existing systems. But explaining that to Vesira's family was like trying to describe color to someone who'd never seen anything but black and white. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm close to something here." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Finally, Vesira had said, "Okay, but he's getting impatient. He thinks you're wasting time on pipe dreams." Pipe dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me. That conversation had happened in July. By November, the family gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable. Thanksgiving dinner at Halcourt Manor had been a masterclass in subtle humiliation. Kalen Drovarn, Vesira's father, had spent the evening discussing real accomplishments with Gavrel, who'd just closed a $40 million acquisition for his investment firm. "It's all about understanding market fundamentals," Gavrel had said, swirling his wine like he was conducting a symphony. "You can't just hope things work out. You need concrete results, measurable outcomes." Kalen had nodded approvingly. "Exactly. That's what separates dreamers from achievers." They hadn't looked directly at me, but the message was crystal clear. I was the dreamer in the room, and dreamers didn't deserve a seat at their table of achievers. Delisa Veranor, Vesira's mother, had been more direct during dessert. "Kalen, honey, when are you going to stop playing scientist and start building a future with our daughter?" Playing scientist. 6 years of research, countless failed prototypes, international patent applications, and preliminary interest from 3 major corporations reduced to playing. "I am building a future," I'd said quietly. "It's just not visible yet." "Well, visible matters," Dulles had replied with a smile that could have cut glass. "Vesira needs security, not experiments." The conversation had continued around me after that, flowing like I wasn't there. Discussion of vacation homes, stock portfolios, country club memberships, and all the tangible markers of success that my garage workshop couldn't provide. But December's Christmas ban was different. This wasn't subtle exclusion or pointed comments. This was explicit rejection. The family meeting had happened 3 days before Christmas. Vesira had come home from Halcourt Manor with red eyes and a defensive posture that told me everything before she said a word. "They think you're holding me back," she'd said, not meeting my eyes. "Dad's concerned about our financial future. Mom thinks you're too old to still be chasing fantasies." Fantasies. Their words, not mine. "What do you think, Vesira?" That pause had lasted forever. When she finally answered, her voice was barely a whisper. "I think I'm tired of defending you when I don't understand what you're working on either." The Christmas Eve text message had been the final verdict. Family only meant I wasn't family anymore, despite the ring on my finger and the vows we'd exchanged 3 years ago. Standing outside Halcourt Manor that night, watching the celebration I'd been excluded from, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd been avoiding for weeks. Janet Morwell, Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions at Silverbrook Industries. Janet had been calling since October, ever since my preliminary patent filing had appeared in industry databases that major corporations monitored for breakthrough technologies. She'd left voicemails about significant acquisition opportunities and life-changing offers. But I'd been hesitant to engage. The technology wasn't completely finished, and some part of me had hoped that Vesira's family would eventually see the value in what I was building. But standing in the December cold, officially banned from Christmas as worthless deadweight, I realized I'd been playing by the wrong rules. I'd been trying to prove myself to people who had already decided my worth based on quarterly earnings and corner office titles. I typed a simple message to Janet. "Available to discuss acquisition terms. When can we meet?" Her response came back in under 2 minutes. "Tomorrow morning. Our offices. This could be the best Christmas gift you've ever given yourself." I looked back at Halcourt Manor one more time. Through the windows, I could see Vesira laughing at something Gavril had said, completely comfortable in a family gathering that had no room for her husband. The December wind picked up, and I turned away from the warmth I'd been excluded from. But for the first time in months, I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking towards something that would prove exactly how wrong they'd been about the worthless dreamer they'd cast out of their family circle. 6 months of careful development were about to pay off in ways that would make their real estate portfolios and hedge fund acquisitions look like lemonade stands. The technology they'd dismissed as playing scientist was about to become the biggest environmental acquisition in industry history. And they had no idea what was coming. The story of how I ended up in that garage workshop, developing technology that would eventually be worth $156 million, started 7 years earlier in the most unexpected place. A water crisis in Clearbrook Township that nobody wanted to talk about. I'd been working as an environmental engineer for Meridian Consulting, a mid-tier firm that specialized in compliance assessments for manufacturing companies. It was steady work, decent pay, and exactly the kind of real job that Vesira's family would later claim I'd never had. But it was also the kind of work that slowly eroded your faith in how the world operated. Most of our clients weren't interested in actually solving environmental problems. They wanted us to find the cheapest way to meet regulatory minimums while maintaining plausible deniability about the long-term consequences of their operations. We were professional box checkers, and I'd become very good at checking boxes. That changed when I met Professor Elena Voroneth. Elena taught hydroengineering at Thornwick Technical Institute, but she spent her summers doing volunteer work in communities that larger engineering firms ignored. Clearbrook Township was one of those places, a former mining community where the groundwater had been contaminated for decades, but where cleanup costs exceeded the property values by several $1,000,000. She'd contacted Meridian Consulting looking for someone willing to do pro bono assessment work. Most of my colleagues had politely declined. Working for free wasn't part of our business model. And Clearbrook's problems weren't the kind that could be solved with standard remediation techniques. But something about Elena's description of the situation had stuck with me. Families boiling water that still wasn't safe to drink. Children developing health problems that doctors couldn't quite explain. An entire community slowly poisoning itself because the existing technology for water treatment was too expensive and too energy-intensive to implement at the scale they needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'd volunteered for the Clearbrook assessment on my own time. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about environmental engineering. The contamination was complex. Heavy metals, industrial solvents, and organic compounds that required different treatment approaches. But more importantly, the economic reality was impossible. Traditional water treatment systems would cost the township more money than they generated in tax revenue over the past decade. Elena and I spent 3 months that summer working on the problem. She brought the theoretical framework, and I brought the practical engineering experience. We set up a makeshift laboratory in an abandoned mining office, testing different filtration approaches and documenting the specific chemical signatures we were dealing with. The problem isn't just technical, Elena had said one evening as we reviewed test results. It's systemic. We're trying to apply industrial-scale solutions to community-scale problems. That insight became the foundation of everything I built afterward. Instead of scaling up expensive technology, what if we could develop something that worked better at smaller scales? What if we could create filtration systems that were more efficient precisely because they were designed for communities rather than massive treatment plants? The breakthrough came in August, during a week when temperatures in Clearbrook hit record highs and our improvised laboratory felt like a sauna. I'd been experimenting with bio-integrated membrane technology, essentially trying to mimic how certain plants naturally filtered water through their root systems. The prototype was crude, built from laboratory tubing and organic compounds that Elena had helped me synthesize. But when we tested it against our contaminated water samples, something remarkable happened. Not only did it remove the heavy metals and solvents we'd been targeting, but it did so using a fraction of the energy that conventional systems required. This isn't just improvement, Elena had said, staring at the test results. This is revolutionary. We'd spent the rest of that summer refining the process, documenting every variable, and testing the system against different types of contamination. By September, we had proof of concept for water filtration technology that could operate at community scale while achieving industrial-grade purification results. That's when I made the mistake that would eventually cost me my job at Meridian Consulting. I'd presented our findings to the senior partners, expecting them to be excited about the potential applications. Instead, I'd walked into a conference room full of skeptical faces and uncomfortable silence. "This is interesting research, Kalen," managing partner Harrison Crestfield had said, "but it's not what we do here. We're a consulting firm, not a technology development company." "But the applications are enormous," I'd responded. "Municipal water systems, industrial remediation, disaster relief. This could change how we approach water treatment entirely." "Could," Harrison had emphasized. "Theoretical applications don't generate billable hours." The conversation had gone downhill from there. They weren't interested in pursuing patent applications or technology development. They certainly weren't interested in me spending company time on what they called speculative research. Within 2 months, I'd been restructured out of my position. The official reason was budget constraints, but everyone knew it was because I'd become more interested in solving problems than billing clients. That's when I met Vesira. She'd been working as a marketing coordinator for Ashmont Gallery, one of Thornwick Heights' upscale art venues. We'd met at a coffee shop where I'd been spending my unemployed afternoons, working on patent applications, and trying to figure out how to fund continued development of the filtration technology. Vesira was everything I wasn't: confident, socially connected, comfortable in expensive restaurants and gallery openings. But she'd been genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about water treatment technology and encouraging me to pursue the patent applications. "You're solving real problems," she'd said during one of our early dates. "That's more important than most people ever do with their careers." For 6 months, that support had been everything I needed. Vesira had helped me navigate the patent application process, connected me with intellectual property attorneys, and even contributed her marketing expertise to help me prepare presentations for potential investors. But somewhere along the way, her family's perspective had started to influence her thinking. The Halcourt family operated in a world where success was measured in quarterly earnings and asset valuations. Derek Corvan had built his commercial real estate empire by identifying undervalued properties and developing them into profitable ventures. Gavril Drozwin managed investment portfolios that generated returns through strategic market timing and risk assessment. In their world, my garage workshop looked like exactly what Dalise had called it, playing scientist. They couldn't see the value in technology that hadn't generated revenue yet. They couldn't understand why someone would spend years developing something without immediate financial returns. And they certainly couldn't comprehend why their daughter would tie her future to someone who chose research over guaranteed income. The pressure had been subtle at first. Suggestions about practical career moves and gentle inquiries about 5-year financial plans. But as months turned into years, and my patent applications moved through the slow machinery of intellectual property law, their patience had worn thin. Vesira had started asking different questions. Instead of wanting to understand the technical details of my work, she'd begun focusing on timelines and monetization strategies. Instead of encouraging my research, she'd started suggesting that maybe I should consider more stable options. The Christmas ban had been the inevitable conclusion of 3 years of growing doubt. In the Halcourt family's assessment, I was a 34-year-old man with no steady income, no corporate title, and no assets beyond a garage full of water filtration prototypes. They had no way of knowing that those prototypes represented breakthrough technology that major corporations had been quietly monitoring. They couldn't see that the patent applications I'd been pursuing were about to become some of the most valuable intellectual property in the environmental technology sector. But Elena Varneth had known. 3 months before the Christmas ban, she'd called to congratulate me on what she'd heard through academic networks. "Industry sources are saying your membrane technology is revolutionary," she'd said. "Major corporations are paying attention." "How do you know that?" "Because Janet Morwell from Silverbrook Industries called me asking for background information about your research." She wouldn't do that unless they were serious about acquisition. That conversation had been the first hint that my years of garage laboratory work were about to pay off in ways that would shock everyone who'd written me off as a dreamer. But I'd kept that information to myself, partly out of superstition and partly because I'd wanted to wait until everything was finalized before sharing news that might not materialize. Now, walking away from Halcourt Manor after being banned from Christmas, I realized that my silence had been a strategic mistake. While I'd been quietly building breakthrough technology, my in-laws had been openly building a case for why I was worthless. Tomorrow morning's meeting with Janet Morwell would change that equation forever. The signs had been there for months, but I'd been too focused on my research to recognize them for what they really were, a systematic campaign to convince Vesira that her husband was a failure. It started with the Sunday dinners. Every week, Vesira would return from Halcourt Manor with a new piece of helpful advice from her family. It was never presented as criticism, always as concern, always wrapped in language about wanting the best for our marriage. Dad mentioned that his friend Harrison Blackwell is looking for senior engineers at Blackwell Environmental. Vesira had said one Sunday in September. It's a director-level position. Real leadership opportunities. I'd been calibrating pressure sensors for my latest prototype, trying to optimize the filtration rate without compromising purification efficiency. That's nice of him to think of me. He's not just thinking of you, Kalen. He's offering to make an introduction. Harrison's been looking for someone with your background for months. The way she'd emphasized offering made it clear this wasn't casual conversation. This was a test of my priorities, presented as an opportunity. I appreciate that, but I'm at a critical stage with the membrane technology. Interrupting development now would set everything back months. Vesira had sat down across from me, her expression somewhere between frustration and concern. How long, though? How long are you going to keep saying you're at a critical stage? It was a fair question, but it was also the wrong question. The right question would have been whether the critical stage was actually leading somewhere valuable. But Vesira had stopped asking about the technical details months earlier. Patent approval typically takes 18 to 24 months, I'd explained. We're at month 16. Once the patents are approved, I'll have protection for the technology and can seriously pursue licensing or acquisition opportunities. 18 to 24 months of what, though? You're not generating income. We're living on my salary and your savings from Meridian. That conversation had been the beginning of a pattern that would define the next 3 months. Every Sunday dinner at Halcourt Manor generated new pressure points, new suggestions about alternative career paths, and new questions about the viability of my research. October had brought escalated tactics. Kalen Drovarn had started joining our conversations, offering insights from his investment management experience. He developed a habit of analyzing my research as if it were a portfolio decision, complete with risk assessments and market timing considerations. "Here's what I don't understand about your approach," he'd said during one particularly uncomfortable dinner. "You're betting everything on technology that might not have commercial applications. In investment terms, that's putting all your assets in a single speculative position." "It's not speculation," I'd replied. "It's research with documented results. But no revenue model, no distribution strategy, no clear path to market." Gavrel had shrugged like he was explaining basic economics to someone who'd never heard of money. "I see early-stage companies pitch to our fund all the time. The ones that succeed have concrete business plans, not just interesting technology." Therick had nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Good ideas are worthless without execution strategy." The subtext wasn't subtle. I had ideas but no execution strategy. I was technically competent but commercially naive. I was an engineer pretending to be an entrepreneur, and everyone at the table could see it except me. Vesira had started agreeing with them. Not openly, not in ways that felt like betrayal, but through small concessions that added up to larger doubts. She'd stopped asking about my research progress. She'd started talking about our financial situation in terms that suggested I was the problem rather than part of the solution. She'd begun making comments about other couples our age who were building real stability together. "Look at Jamie and Marcus," she'd said one evening in November. "They just bought that house in Willowbrook Estates. 3 bedrooms, 2-car garage, enough space to start a family." Jamie worked in pharmaceutical sales. Marcus was a project manager at a construction company. They had steady paychecks, predictable career trajectories, and the kind of conventional success that made mortgage approval straightforward. "That's great for them," I'd said. "Different people build stability in different ways. But their way is working. They're moving forward with their lives." "Are we not moving forward?" That question had hung in the air for a long time before Vesira answered. "Sometimes it feels like we're waiting for something that might never happen." The Thanksgiving dinner disaster had been inevitable. Therick had decided to make the family dynamics explicit. Instead of subtle pressure and gentle suggestions, he'd chosen direct confrontation as his preferred strategy. "Kalen, I want to have an honest conversation with you," he'd said over dessert, speaking loudly enough that the entire table could hear. "You've been working on this water project for what, 5 years now?" 6 years if you count the original research. 6 years. "And in that time, what do you have to show for it?" The question was designed to be unanswerable in ways that would satisfy him. I could talk about breakthrough membrane technology, international patent applications, and preliminary corporate interest, but none of those things translated into the metrics he cared about. "I have proof of concept for revolutionary water treatment technology," I'd said carefully. "Multiple patent applications in process and early interest from major corporations." "Interest," Therick had repeated. "Not offers, not contracts, interest." That's how technology development works. You create intellectual property, then you license or sell it. Or you spend years creating something that never generates revenue. He'd leaned back in his chair, adopting the posture of someone about to deliver uncomfortable truth. "I've been in business for 25 years. I've seen a lot of smart people chase ideas that never turned into income." Gavril had joined the intervention. "The challenge is opportunity cost. Every year you spend on speculative research is a year you're not building conventional career equity." Dalise had provided the emotional component. "We're just worried about Vesira's future. She's 31 years old. If she wants to start a family, she needs financial security." The message was clear. I was preventing Vesira from having the future she deserved. "Has Vesira told you she's unhappy with our financial situation?" I'd asked. The silence that followed told me everything. They'd been discussing our marriage, our finances, and my career prospects without including me in the conversation. I was the subject of family meetings where I wasn't allowed to defend myself or explain my perspective. "We're just concerned," Therick had said finally. "Marriage is about partnership. Right now it feels like Vesira is carrying most of the financial responsibility." That statement had hurt more than anything else they could have said, because it contained enough truth to make me question myself. Vesira was generating steady income while I was burning through savings, and hoping for future returns on intellectual property that might never materialize. But it also revealed something important about how they viewed our relationship. In their assessment, marriage was primarily an economic arrangement. Love, compatibility, shared values, and mutual support were secondary to financial contribution ratios. I'd looked at Vesira, hoping to see disagreement or discomfort with her family's characterization of our marriage. Instead, I'd seen her nodding along with their concerns. That night, driving home from Thanksgiving dinner, we'd had our first serious fight about my research. "Maybe they have a point," Vesira had said. "Maybe it's time to consider other options." Other options like what? Like taking the position Dad offered to arrange. Like building a career that generates actual income. This is building a career. It's just taking longer than traditional paths. How much longer, though? How many more years are you willing to spend on something that might not work out? The question hung between us like a challenge. How many more years was I willing to invest in technology that could revolutionize water treatment, or might never generate a single dollar of revenue? "Until it works," I had said, "however long that takes." Vesira had stared out the passenger window for the rest of the drive home. When we'd gotten to our apartment, she'd gone straight to bed without saying goodnight. The Christmas ban had been the inevitable conclusion of 3 months of escalating pressure. Her family had decided I was a liability, and they'd convinced Vesira to agree with their assessment. Standing outside Halcourt Manor on Christmas Eve, officially excluded from the family celebration, I'd finally understood the true nature of the campaign they'd been waging against me. It wasn't just about career advice or financial concerns. It was about proving that I didn't belong in their world of measured success and guaranteed returns. Tomorrow's meeting with Janet Morwell would prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The morning after Christmas, I walked into the Silverbrook Industries headquarters building. With 6 years of research documentation, 3 pending patent applications, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Janet Morwell's office occupied the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Thornwick Heights financial district. The space was designed to impress polished granite surfaces, contemporary art, and the subtle hum of climate control systems that kept everything at precisely optimal temperature. Janet herself was exactly what I'd expected from our phone conversations. Early 50s, silver hair pulled back in an efficient style, and the kind of focused intensity that came from making billion-dollar acquisition decisions for one of the largest environmental technology corporations in the world. "Kalen," she said, standing to shake my hand, "I'm glad you finally decided to take this meeting. We've been watching your patent applications with considerable interest. I apologize for the delay. I wanted to make sure the technology was ready for a serious discussion." She gestured toward a conference table where 3 other people were waiting: Dr. Marcus Thorne, Silverbrook's Chief Technology Officer, Sarah Chen, Director of Strategic Development, and David Kellerman, Senior Vice President of Acquisitions. "Before we begin," Janet said, "I want to be clear about something. We don't typically pursue individual inventors. Most of our acquisitions involve established companies with proven revenue streams and scalable business models." I nodded, understanding the subtext. This meeting was unusual for them, which meant my technology had captured attention at the highest levels of corporate decision-making. However, Dr. Thorne added, "Your membrane filtration patents represent breakthrough technology that could fundamentally change how we approach water treatment operations." Sarah Chen opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. "We've conducted preliminary analysis of your patent applications. The efficiency improvements over existing systems are remarkable." I looked at the documents. They contained detailed technical assessments of my filtration technology, cost-benefit analyses, and market projection studies. Silverbrook had invested serious resources in evaluating my work. "How long have you been analyzing my patents?" I asked. 4 months, David Kellerman replied. "Ever since your first application appeared in the international database, we have algorithms that flag potentially disruptive technologies." 4 months. That meant they'd been studying my work since August, while Vesira's family had been pressuring me to abandon my research and pursue real career opportunities. "The question," Janet continued, "is whether you're interested in licensing your technology or selling it outright. What's the difference?" Dr. Thorne leaned forward. "Licensing means you retain ownership of the patents, while granting us exclusive rights to manufacture and distribute systems based on your technology. You'd receive royalty payments based on sales volume. Acquisition means we purchase the patents entirely, Sarah added. You receive a lump sum payment and potentially ongoing consultation fees, but you transfer all ownership rights to Silverbrook. David pulled out a calculator and began entering numbers. Licensing typically generates smaller immediate payments but potentially larger long-term returns if the technology is widely adopted. Acquisition offers guaranteed payment regardless of market performance, Janet said. Less potential upside, but no risk if commercialization doesn't proceed as projected. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Vesira the night before, when she'd come home from Christmas dinner at Halcourt Manor. My family thinks you should consider taking Dad's job offer, she'd said, at least until your patent stuff gets sorted out. Patent stuff. 6 years of breakthrough research reduced to stuff that needed to be sorted out while I pursued conventional employment. What kind of numbers are we discussing? I asked. The room went quiet. Janet exchanged glances with her colleagues, then opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper. For full acquisition of all current and pending patents, she said, Silverbrook Industries is prepared to offer $156 million. The number hit me like a physical force. I'd known my technology was valuable, but I'd been thinking in terms of licensing deals worth millions over several years. $156 million was generational wealth. Additionally, Dr. Thorne said, we'd want to retain you as Chief Innovation Officer for our water treatment division. 5-year contract, significant equity participation, and resources to continue developing next-generation filtration technologies. Sarah Chen slid another document across the table. The salary for that position would be $450,000 annually, plus performance bonuses that could double that amount. I stared at the numbers, trying to process what they meant. 24 hours earlier, I'd been banned from Christmas dinner as worthless deadweight. Now I was sitting in a conference room where one of the world's largest corporations wanted to pay me more money than most people earned in several lifetimes. There is one complication, David Kellerman said carefully. We need to move quickly. We have reliable intelligence that 2 of our major competitors are developing similar technologies. If we're going to maintain market advantage, we need to lock down your patents within the next 30 days. What does that timeline look like? Ideally, Janet said, we'd have signed agreements by January 15th. That gives us time to integrate your technology into our product development pipeline and begin manufacturing preparation. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to make a decision that would determine the rest of my life. Can I have some time to consider the offer? Of course, Janet replied. But I want to emphasize how rare this opportunity is. Silverbrook doesn't typically pursue acquisition at this scale for unproven technology. Your patents represent exactly the kind of breakthrough we've been looking for. Dr. Thorne added, the potential applications extend far beyond municipal water treatment. Disaster relief, military operations, industrial remediation, developing world infrastructure. This technology could impact millions of people. As I walked out of Silverbrook's headquarters an hour later, I felt like I was experiencing someone else's life. The same research that Vesira's family had dismissed as impractical dreaming was worth more money than their combined net worth. But more than that, I finally understood the true scope of what they'd been trying to do to me. It wasn't just career advice or financial concern. They'd been systematically undermining my confidence, isolating me from Vesira's emotional support, and positioning themselves as the voice of practical wisdom while I pursued supposedly hopeless fantasies. Theric Corvin's offer to arrange a job interview hadn't been helpfulness. It had been an attempt to redirect my career towards something he could understand and control. Gavril's investment analysis of my research hadn't been professional insight. It had been deliberate sabotage disguised as expertise. Dalisa's concerns about financial security hadn't been maternal protectiveness. They'd been emotional manipulation designed to make Vesira question our marriage. The Christmas ban hadn't been about family harmony. It had been the final step in a campaign to prove that I didn't belong in their world of successful, practical people. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that their definition of success was the only definition that mattered. They'd measured my worth based on quarterly earnings and corporate titles, never considering that breakthrough technology might generate wealth that dwarfed their conventional achievements. I drove home through Thornwick Heights, passing the Halcourt Manor where I'd been excluded from Christmas dinner, and pulled into the garage where I'd spent 6 years developing technology that was about to make me one of the wealthiest people in the city. Vesira was in the kitchen when I walked into our apartment, still wearing the elegant dress she'd worn to her family's Christmas celebration. "How was the meeting?" she asked, without looking up from her coffee. "Productive," I said carefully. "Very productive." I didn't tell her about the $156 million offer. I didn't mention the Chief Innovation Officer position or the equity participation or the $450,000 salary. Instead, I sat down across from her and asked a question that would determine whether our marriage could survive what was about to happen. "If I told you that my research was about to pay off in a major way, would you believe me?" She looked up from her coffee, and I saw something in her expression that broke my heart. Not excitement or curiosity or support, but skepticism mixed with the kind of tired patience people use with someone they've given up on. "I want to believe you," she said. "I really do, but we've been having this conversation for 3 years." That's when I knew our marriage was over, regardless of what Silverbrook Industries was willing to pay for my patents. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I'd wake up each morning knowing I was sitting on the largest environmental technology acquisition in corporate history, but living like nothing had changed. Vesira went back to work at Ashmont Gallery, continuing her routine of managing social media campaigns for artists whose work sold for more money than most people made in a year. She'd come home each evening with stories about gallery openings and collector meetings, completely unaware that her husband was negotiating a deal that would make their art sales look like garage sale transactions. I spent my days in the garage workshop, continuing to refine the filtration technology, while Janet Morwell's legal team conducted due diligence on my patent applications. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same space where Vesira's family thought I was playing scientist had become the center of one of the largest corporate acquisitions in Silverbrook's history. But the real challenge wasn't technical or legal, it was psychological. For 6 years, I'd been building technology in isolation, sustained by the belief that breakthrough innovation would eventually prove its worth. Now that validation was arriving in the form of a 9-figure acquisition offer, and I had no idea how to process what that meant for my relationships with the people who'd written me off. The test came on January 8th, when Vesira announced that her family was hosting a New Year's dinner party. "It's not a big deal," she said, avoiding eye contact as she made the announcement. "Just close family and a few business associates. Dad wants to introduce Gavril to some potential investors." The subtext was clear. This was another gathering where I wouldn't be welcome. Another family celebration where Vesira's worthless husband would be an embarrassment to their successful social circle. "Are you inviting me?" I asked. The pause before her answer told me everything. "Dad thinks it would be better if this one stays small." Small meaning without me. Meaning focused on business networking. You know how these things work. I did know how these things worked. Theric Corvan had spent months positioning me as someone who didn't belong in conversations about real success and meaningful achievement. Inviting me to a dinner party with potential investors would undermine the narrative he'd been building. "What if I told you I had significant business news to share?" I asked. Vesira looked up from her phone, where she'd been checking her social media notifications. "What kind of business news?" "The kind that might change how your family thinks about my research." Her expression shifted from distracted politeness to cautious interest. "Kalen, what's going on?" I'd been dreading this moment for 2 weeks. Not because I was afraid to tell Vesira about the Silverbrook offer, but because I knew her reaction would determine whether our marriage had any chance of surviving what was about to happen. "Remember how your family keeps asking when my research will turn into real income?" "Yes." Well, it just did. I walked to my desk and retrieved the preliminary acquisition agreement that Janet Morwell had sent over for my review. The document was 47 pages of legal language, but the number that mattered was clearly stated in the executive summary. Vesira read the first page, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not excitement or pride or vindication, but something closer to shock mixed with disbelief. "This says $156 million. "That's correct. For your water filtration patents. For all current and pending intellectual property, plus a consulting agreement and equity participation in future development." She flipped through the document, scanning sections about payment timelines, technology transfer procedures, and employment terms. "When did this happen?" "I've been in negotiations for 2 weeks, since the day after Christmas." The silence that followed was longer than comfortable. When Vesira finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was a fair question, but also a revealing one. The real question was why I'd felt like I couldn't tell her. Why I'd spent 2 weeks keeping the most important development of my career secret from my wife. Because I wasn't sure you'd believe it, I said honestly. Your family has spent months convincing you that my research is worthless. I wanted to wait until everything was finalized. My family doesn't think your research is worthless. Your family banned me from Christmas dinner because they think I'm worthless. Vesira set the document down and rubbed her temples like she was developing a headache. That's not why they asked you not to come. Then why? Because they're worried about me, about us, about our future together. And now? She gestured at the Silverbrook agreement. Now I don't know what to think. That response told me everything I needed to know about where our marriage stood. Vesira wasn't excited about my success. She wasn't proud of what I'd accomplished or vindicated in her decision to support my research. She was confused because the development didn't fit the narrative her family had created about our relationship. There's something else, I said. Silverbrook wants me to join their executive team, Chief Innovation Officer for their water treatment division. What does that mean? It means relocating to their headquarters in Portland. It means a salary that's more than your father makes from commercial real estate. It means resources to continue developing technologies that could impact millions of people. Vesira stared at the document for a long time before responding. When do you have to decide? January 15th, 1 week from today. And you want to take it. I want to take it, but I want to know if you're willing to take it with me. That question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Was Vesira willing to leave Thornwick Heights, her family, her job at Ashmont Gallery, and everything that defined her social identity to support her husband's career transition? More importantly, was she willing to acknowledge that the man her family had written off as a failure had just received one of the largest technology acquisition offers in corporate history? I need to think about it, she said finally. What's there to think about? Everything, Kalen. My job, my family, my life here. You're asking me to give up everything I've built for something I don't understand. I'm asking you to share in the most significant achievement of my career. I'm asking you to consider that maybe there are more important things than career achievements. We'd reached the fundamental incompatibility that had been growing between us for months. Vesira valued stability, community, and family connections. I valued innovation, intellectual challenge, and the pursuit of meaningful work. Neither of us was wrong, but we wanted different things from life. Have you told my parents about this? She asked. No, I wanted to discuss it with you first. They're going to be shocked. They're going to be forced to acknowledge that they were wrong about me. Vesira looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part frustration. Is that what this is about? Proving them wrong? This is about building a career that matters. It's about having the resources to solve problems that affect millions of people. It's about not apologizing for pursuing work that takes longer than conventional timelines. And it's about proving my family wrong. I couldn't deny that component of my motivation. For months, Therick, Gavrel, and Dalis had positioned themselves as the voice of practical wisdom while I pursued supposedly foolish dreams. Having those dreams validated with a 9-figure acquisition offer felt like vindication. But it was more than that. The Silverbrook deal represented validation that breakthrough technology development was worth pursuing, even when it required years of investment without guaranteed returns. Your family made it clear that I don't belong in their world, I said. Now I'm not sure I want to belong in their world. That evening, Vesira called her mother to tell her about the Silverbrook offer. I could hear Dalis's voice through the phone, alternating between disbelief and what sounded like damage control. Well, that's wonderful news, Dalis was saying. Although I hope Kalen understands that money isn't everything, family and community connections matter too. Even faced with evidence that my research had generated more wealth than their family had accumulated over decades, they were still finding ways to minimize the achievement. The next morning, Therick called me directly. Vesira told us about your business development, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Congratulations on the opportunity. Thank you. I hope you'll consider the broader implications before making any hasty decisions. What kind of broader implications? Moving to Portland means leaving everything you've built here. Career opportunities, family relationships, community connections. Sometimes it's worth considering whether short-term gains are worth long-term sacrifices. Short-term gains. $156 million characterized as a short-term gain. I appreciate your concern, I said, but this represents the opportunity of a lifetime. I understand that. I just want to make sure you're thinking about Vesira's needs as well as your own. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the message was clear. Even after being proven spectacularly wrong about the value of my research, Theric was still positioning himself as the voice of practical wisdom, while I remained the dreamer who needed guidance from more experienced people. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to convince Vesira's family that they'd been wrong about me, I would show them exactly how wrong they'd been in the most public way possible. The New Year's dinner party was scheduled for January 10th. I would sign the Silverbrook Agreement on January 9th, and the acquisition announcement would be released to financial media on January 10th. Theric wanted to host a business networking dinner where I wouldn't be welcome. Instead, he was about to host a dinner party where the biggest business story of the year would break while his guests were eating appetizers. I called Janet Morwell to accelerate our timeline. "Can we finalize everything by January 9th?" I asked. "We can, if you're ready to commit." "Is there a particular reason for the urgency?" "I want to announce this news at a family gathering on January 10th. Janet laughed. "I like your style. Let's make it happen." January 10th arrived with the kind of crisp winter evening that made Halcourt Manor look like something from a luxury magazine. Through the tall windows, I could see Theric's carefully curated dinner party in full swing. Crystal glasses catching chandelier light, guests in expensive suits discussing investment opportunities, and Gavril holding court near the fireplace with his usual confident gestures. I stood at the front door for the second time in 3 weeks, but this time I wasn't banned from entry. This time, I had an invitation that Vesira had reluctantly extended after I'd informed her that my Silverbrook deal was finalized, and the announcement would be released to financial media that evening. "Kalen," Theric said as he opened the door, his smile strained but polite. "Vesira mentioned you had some business news to share." "Significant business news," I replied, stepping into the foyer where the familiar scent of expensive wine and aged leather reminded me of every uncomfortable family gathering I'd endured. The dinner party included 12 guests, mostly Theric's commercial real estate associates and a few potential investors that Gavril had been courting for his hedge fund expansion. They represented exactly the kind of established wealth and conventional success that had made me feel like an outsider for 3 years. "Everyone," Theric announced as we entered the main dining room, "I'd like you to meet my son-in-law, Kalen Drovarn. He's been working on some technology projects." Technology projects. Even after learning about the Silverbrook acquisition, Theric couldn't bring himself to characterize my work as anything more substantial than hobbyist tinkering. "What kind of technology?" asked Robert Crestwind, one of Theric's longtime business partners. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Janet Morwell. "Press release goes live in 30 minutes. Congratulations again." "Water purification systems," I said simply. "I develop filtration technology for industrial and municipal applications." Gavril joined the conversation with his trademark condescending smile. "Kalen's been working on that project for several years now. Very dedicated to the research process." The subtext was clear to everyone in the room. I was the dreamer who spent years on projects that never generated real results, while they were the practical businessmen who understood how wealth was actually created. "Any commercial applications?" Robert asked politely. "Actually, yes." I pulled out my phone and opened the email draft I'd prepared. "I signed an acquisition agreement yesterday with Silverbrook Industries. They are purchasing my patent portfolio for water treatment technology." The room went noticeably quieter. Even the background conversation near the bar seemed to pause as Theric's guests processed what I'd just said. "That's wonderful," Dalisa said carefully. "What kind of acquisition are we talking about?" I showed them the press release that would be published in 25 minutes. Silverbrook Industries announces $156 million acquisition of revolutionary water treatment patents. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced at a Halcourt family gathering. No polite small talk, no gentle redirect to safer topics. Just pure, stunned quiet, as 12 successful business people tried to process that the family disappointment had just announced a 9-figure technology sale. Theric was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. "That's quite an achievement, Kalen." "Thank you. It's been 6 years in development." "6 years that we thought you were wasting," Vesira said quietly from across the room, her voice barely audible but cutting through the silence like a blade. That's when the real confrontation began. Gavril was the first to attempt damage control, his investment advisor instincts kicking in as he tried to minimize what everyone had just heard. "Well, that's certainly impressive," he said, his voice carrying the strained enthusiasm of someone trying to sound supportive while processing their own shock. "Although I imagine the actual payout structure is probably more complex than a simple acquisition price." "Actually, it's quite straightforward," I replied, pulling up the signed agreement on my phone. $156 million, paid in full within 90 days of patent transfer completion. Robert Crestwind, who managed one of Thornwick Heights' largest commercial development firms, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Silverbrook Industries? They're publicly traded, aren't they?" "NASDAQ listing, market cap around $40 billion, I confirmed. They specialize in environmental technology acquisitions." "My God," whispered Margaret Tornsley, Therick's longtime business partner. "That's larger than most of our annual development budgets combined." The room's dynamic was shifting rapidly. The same business associates who'd been politely listening to Gavril's investment insights were now staring at me with the kind of focused attention reserved for people who'd just announced they were worth more than everyone else in the room. Therick cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of his own dinner party. "This is certainly exciting news for our family, though I hope everyone understands that success comes in many forms." "Dad," Vesira said sharply, her voice cutting through his diplomatic deflection. "Stop!" The word hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time in the 3 years I'd known her, Vesira was directly contradicting her father in front of his business associates. "Stop what?" Therick asked, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Stop trying to minimize this. Stop acting like it's not exactly what you said would never happen." She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. "For 2 years, you've been telling anyone who would listen that my husband was a failure, that he was wasting his time on impossible projects, that I deserved better than someone who would never amount to anything." Dallas stepped forward, her voice urgent with the kind of panic that comes from watching carefully constructed social dynamics collapse in real time. "Vesira, this isn't the appropriate venue for family discussions." "No, this is exactly the appropriate venue," Vesira replied, her voice growing stronger. "Because these are the same people you complained to about Kalen's lack of ambition. The same people you told that I was married to someone who would never provide financial security." My phone buzzed with notifications as the Silverbrook press release went live across financial news platforms. Within minutes, the acquisition was trending on business Twitter, and my name was appearing in headlines I'd never imagined seeing. "The announcement just broke," I said, showing the screen to the room. "Forbes, Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch. It's the largest environmental technology acquisition this quarter." Margaret Tornsley was frantically typing on her own phone, presumably looking up the news coverage. "It's everywhere," she said, her voice filled with amazement. "CNN Business, Bloomberg, Reuters. They're calling it revolutionary technology." Gavril made one final attempt to maintain his position as the room's investment authority. "Of course, the real question is how effectively Kalen will manage this windfall. Sudden wealth can be challenging without proper financial planning expertise." That's when I delivered the information that ended any remaining doubt about my capabilities. "Silverbrook also offered me a position as Chief Innovation Officer," I said calmly. 5-year contract, $450,000 annually, plus equity participation that could be worth millions more depending on how widely the technology is adopted. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocked quiet. This was the silence of people realizing they'd completely misjudged someone, and that their misjudgment had been witnessed by an entire room of their professional peers. Therick's face had gone pale. The man who'd spent months positioning himself as a mentor figure offering guidance to his impractical son-in-law was now standing in his own dining room, surrounded by business associates who'd just watched him be proven spectacularly wrong about the most important business decision any of them had encountered. But the real consequences were just beginning. 9 months later, I stood in my new office on the 38th floor of Silverbrook's Portland headquarters, watching the Columbia River wind through the city below. The view was spectacular, but what struck me most was how quiet everything felt compared to the chaos of those final weeks in Thornwick Heights. The dinner party had been the beginning of the end for multiple relationships. Within days of the acquisition announcement, Therick's business network had started asking pointed questions about his judgment regarding family investments and emerging opportunities. Several of his associates had inquired whether he'd considered partnering with me on technology ventures. not realizing that he'd spent years discouraging exactly that kind of forward-thinking approach. Gavril had attempted to salvage his reputation by claiming he'd, quote, in my research, but the damage to his credibility as an investment advisor was irreversible. When your expertise involves identifying valuable opportunities, publicly dismissing a $156 million success story doesn't inspire confidence in your analytical abilities. Vesira and I had separated in March. Not because of anger or betrayal, but because we'd finally acknowledged what had been true for months. We wanted fundamentally different things from life. She valued community, family proximity, and social stability. I valued innovation, intellectual challenge, and the freedom to pursue meaningful work regardless of conventional timelines. "I'm proud of what you accomplished," she'd said during our final conversation, "but I can't pretend I understand why it matters more than everything else." That statement had crystallized the core incompatibility between us. For Vesira, success was valuable primarily as it contributed to family harmony and social acceptance. For me, success was valuable because it enabled larger contributions to solving problems that affected millions of people. Neither perspective was wrong, but they were incompatible in ways that made marriage unsustainable. The real lesson from the entire experience wasn't about vindication or proving doubters wrong. It was about understanding that other people's definitions of worth don't have to become your own internal metrics. For 3 years, I'd allowed Theric's focus on quarterly earnings and Gavril's emphasis on conventional career progression to make me question the value of breakthrough research. I'd internalized their skepticism to the point where even I had started wondering whether 6 years of technology development was really worth pursuing. But the work itself had always been valuable, regardless of whether they could recognize it. The filtration technology I developed would eventually provide clean water access to communities that couldn't afford traditional treatment systems. That impact existed independent of acquisition offers or family approval. The Silverbrook deal had validated my research financially, but the research had been meaningful long before corporate interest translated it into market value. Professor Elena Varaneth had called me after the acquisition announcement to congratulate me on the achievement, but also to remind me of something important. "The money is wonderful," she'd said, "but don't forget that the technology was already changing lives before anyone paid you for it. That's the real measure of whether your work matters." She was right. Success wasn't about proving Theric wrong or generating enough wealth to command respect from people who dismissed me. Success was about building something that made the world marginally better, then protecting the space to continue building. I'd learned to recognize the difference between people who supported the work and people who supported the outcomes. Vesira's family had been interested in the outcomes, the status, the financial security, the social validation that came with conventional success. But they'd never been interested in the work itself, the daily process of solving complex problems that might not generate immediate returns. Moving forward, I would surround myself with people who valued the work, not just the results. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.